Thank you very much for that. Our final speaker today is Thomas Steinfatt, who's a professor of communication at the University of Miami and a Fulbright Scholar working at the Royal University of Phnom Penh. His research on trafficking is funded by USAID and the UNIAP, receiving a top award for a 2007 initiative on the best methods for measuring human trafficking. And in a sense, that was the marker that said to us that we would like to hear about your work. And so from that perspective, I think that having looked at the macro, we can start maybe thinking about the micro as well. And with that in mind, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'd like to say I'll try to be brief, but as we all know, when somebody carries something like this up here, I'll just read the first paper now. These are just a few notes here, and I'll try not to go too far on each of them, and excuse me, but I am going to have to wear my glasses for some of them here, right? Just a couple of position kinds of statements, I think. And that is, at times people have accused me of believing that trafficking doesn't exist. That could not be farther from the truth. Trafficking clearly exists. You've heard many examples of it here. I have seen it personally. I have been in the presence of trafficked people. I've been in the presence of traffickers. I know it exists. The principal question for me, in all of this aside, obviously, from what should we do about it, is really what the number looks like. How many are there? Where are they? And before you can really do anything, you need to know a little bit about them. How many people you're talking about, approximately where they're located, and so on. So, just wanted to state that as a position thing at first, in case it sounds like I don't believe that. Absolutely not correct. What I'm going to do is tell you briefly one sort of historical kind of thing, and then I'm going to go into my work. But I think it's important to look at the history of certain kinds of things, particularly the history of prostitution, and the way it's been legalized or not legalized, and the way it's been treated, particularly from European nations. And I guess I would include the U.S. as, you know, a European type nation anyway here. Some of the first kind of history of statements about prostitution that exist in Western literature come around the 4th century. And St. Augustine makes a statement. St. Augustine actually was a guy apparently like me in terms of, I'm a communication professor. He taught public speaking of all things. And he talks about himself from the time up till he was about 40 years old as being something of a roue, went around seeing prostitutes, doing various kinds of things, but then saw the light, became a Christian, and decided to, spend the rest of his life dedicated to Christianity. At one point, he estimated in his writings a number of things about prostitute, not their numbers or whatever, but he said, if I can find the statement that I copied down from him here, basically, okay, he compared sex work at the time, which was again 4th century AD, with if you were to move sex work, what would happen? He said, well, what would happen if you removed a sewer pipe from a castle? Obviously not a very good implication about prostitution, not a positive thing, but he said if you remove that sewer pipe, the castle would fill up with all this stuff, and you couldn't possibly live there. Therefore, we cannot remove the sewer pipe from the castle. We must support the existence of prostitution. Interesting, okay? So some of the early Christian doctrines on this. Next really well-known thing came from many, many years later, a century later, 1,000 years later. St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century was asked for his comments on prostitution and what he thought about prostitution. And he said some things very similar to what St. Augustine had said. And I can see I'm going to need my water early on here. St. Thomas Aquinas said, if I can, basically that sex workers were clearly allowed to participate in all of the Christian parades. Anytime the church had a parade, there were many workers and workers' unions, that they would call unions necessarily at that time, but they all marched together, and the prostitutes marched as one segment in most European kinds of cities at that time. So at his time, he simply noted that and said, well, we really can't, we don't like it, but, it's there and there's not a whole lot we can do about it. Moving on a little bit to my namesake, actually, Martin Luther. My name's Thomas Martin Steinfatt, and I'm actually named after Martin Luther. I was raised a Lutheran here. Martin Luther is the guy who really put the kind of the shiv into prostitution. And he said, as you probably know, he was very much in favor of priests being able to marry. That was one of his principal things. And along with that, he said, priests should have the right to marry because they should enjoy the benefits of marriage, and marriage is very important to people. However, sex outside of marriage, as Martin Luther, sex outside of marriage, bad, evil, awful, and of course he included prostitution in that, as well as any kind of casual affairs or whatever else. He was not terribly influential in that. No one has ever said that has. We're going to wipe out prostitution. Not going to happen, hasn't happened. You can put pressures on it, you can do things to it, but you're not going to wipe it out. And not too many people paid too much attention to Martin Luther, but that issue became part particularly of Protestant, not Catholic, Christianity. Generally, Protestants are far stronger on an anti-prostitution notion, probably coming from Martin Luther's initial thing. I don't know that or whatever. Moving on again in a few centuries, the next major thing in Western society that I was able to find at least comes from the Napoleonic Code. For whatever reason, Napoleon decided that within that code, he of course didn't write it, but authorized it, but within the Napoleonic Code, prostitution was going to be illegal. Now, this is somewhat, if you'll excuse me for saying it, amusing in a way, because this is France. And if you know anything about France or Paris or Saigon, from the French aspect, there definitely was no prohibition of sex work. On the other hand, the Napoleonic Code said it, but it was completely ignored in almost all French cities all the time. But it's in the Napoleonic Code, the first codified statement that prostitution should be really illegal and should not be allowed. Not too long, well, actually, some time after, it was after the Civil War, after the American Civil War, about 1869, Victor Hugo wrote a letter to a woman who had been very, very strongly working with prostitutes. One of her sons had been killed, and she wanted to do something with her life. She went down to the docks, and she looked at the sex workers who were working with the sailors who came off ships. That's one of the lowest class sex work areas you can get. There are all sorts of classes of prostitutes. Please don't think there's just one. There's all sorts of classes. And that's one of the lowest class, and she started to work with those people. And she learned a great deal about them, initially being opposed to them, but then saying, okay, she actually talked her husband, who was the headmaster of a school, to letting some of these women move into the house with her. I'm not sure that's how exactly that worked out. But anyway, she became very strong in this, and Victor Hugo wrote a letter to her. And he said in that letter, and this is not a direct quote, but pretty close, now that the trade in blacks is removed, referring to the U.S. Civil War, and of course that wasn't at all true, really, even with the Emancipation Proclamation and all that. Now that the trade in blacks has been removed, we must attack or go after the trade in whites. The trade in whites came to be translated in a couple of ways. He was referring to prostitution there, and the trade in whites came to be called white slavery as opposed to black slavery. And so the white slavery comment is usually attributed to that statement in that letter of Victor Hugo. However accurate that is. Not long after Victor Hugo wrote that, there were quite a number of brothels operating in almost any city in Europe and any city in America. If you look at the women who populated the West, there were very few wives who went along with those guys who were out there killing all the Indians so it could be safe for all the white people who were out on the west of the Mississippi. And, whether you like that or not, I certainly don't like that idea, but nonetheless, the people who were being female companions to them were almost all prostitutes. These were not wives, these were not girlfriends. And a lot of women made quite a lot of money actually clearing the West for America to expand. Prostitutes never get credit for being part of that expansion. Whether they should get credit or be blamed for it with what we did to the Indians, I don't know. But nonetheless, prostitution was a very strong part of that. In London particularly, there were quite a number of newspapers, and I think there was a count of over 120 daily newspapers. There was no radio, obviously, no television. Newspapers were just in high competition, a lot of them very low circulation. One of the low circulations ones was a newspaper by the name of the Pall Mall Gazette. It was published by a gentleman by the name of W.T. Stead, S-T-E-A-D, I believe. Stead was looking for a lead, something that would bring readers in by my paper, not all these other papers. He heard a story that one of the brothels in London featured young children. He investigated this, meaning he went to the brothel. He saw that this was, in fact, the case. It was apparently the only brothel that had any young workers, meaning basically under 18 from what we can gather from what they were saying. I don't think they were saying young by under 12, but some of the women some of the women, some of the girls in this were clearly under 12. There were some very, very, very young girls in this brothel. He was horrified, as he should have been, and he went back and he got together with some writers, and they wrote a huge article on this, and it became a series of articles. It was called The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon, and it's a major factor in the history of prostitution. So the Maiden Tribute to Modern Babylon starts getting huge circulation for his newspaper. Steed enlisted some help, by the way, from people who later formed the Salvation Army, William Booth and his brother, as a matter of fact, later called General William Booth in the Salvation Army. And together they put an ad in Steed's paper advertising for a domestic. A family agreed to give him their daughter as a domestic. She was about 14, something like that. He paid the family what they were asking and immediately had the Booths spirit the girl across the channel to France. And she was very frightened. She wanted to go home. She didn't know what was happening. And Booth wrote this up as he is the first person to have claimed at least to rescue a girl from slavery. Well, he sort of caused the girl to go into slavery. He took a lot of bad press for that. Anyway, but Steed very strongly supported for about the next 10 years all of the various things that happened in Britain. If you follow British law around that time, somewhere in the 1880s, it could have been the 1870s, I may be off a decade, but somewhere in there, the first really strong anti-brothel, anti-prostitution laws were passed. Shortly after that is the time of Jack the Ripper, which may or may not have been coincident with that. Because what happened when they kicked the women out of the brothels, they did it rather forcefully in some cases. The good women who were married or whatever took their broomsticks down to a brothel, would charge into the brothel, and would begin to beat the sex workers to drive them out of the place. And then they would either burn it or close it or whatever. The women, thus drawn onto the street, had no protection from the police. That's a fundamentally important kind of thing. If prostitutes have no protection from the police, what are they going to do? Well, what they did in Britain at that time, in London, is they went to the darkest streets, which is the only place they could ply their trade, where police officers didn't want to go. And that's about the time that Jack the Ripper happens, too. Now, we can't draw a conclusion. Well, Ripper was able to do that then because of those laws. But nonetheless, it did happen at that time. There's no necessary causal relationship. But a lot of women started to be really beat up and really attacked because they could not go to the police with their problems. If you make prostitution illegal, you create great problems for women who work in that profession. So in any case, Steed went on like this for quite some time. About 10 years after he started doing that, he started to turn, and he started to see what was happening to some of the sex workers. And he changed, as a matter of fact, and he left the paper, and he started lecturing. He came to the United States, and he lectured in the U.S. against this thing. One of the people that he talked to was a guy, I'm probably going to mess up his first name. I think it was James Mann. Somehow it strikes me as James Robertson Mann, but I may be incorrect on that. Last name was certainly Mann, spelled M-A-N-N. He was an alderman, I believe, in Chicago initially, became a legislator in the state of Illinois. And Illinois, in the 1890s, passed the first U.S. legislation against prostitution. Mann later went on to Congress and got passed what is not too surprisingly called the Mann Act, which is not referred to, it's the U.S. anti-prostitution statute. It was passed largely not because of any particular abhorrence of prostitution, but principally as an anti-black act. There was a particular boxer, as you may or may not know, you should study the history of boxing, quite interesting. But anyway, Jack Johnson. And Jack Johnson was the heavyweight champion of the world. Jack was black. And you don't let anybody, if you are white, you don't let anybody fight for the title who is black. Nobody could get a shot at the title. But Johnson was so good that he beat everybody. And finally, after John L. Sullivan with his, if you ever see him standing there with his mustache and pictures like this, and all the rest of them, Gentleman Jim Corbett and the rest of them, just no. Finally, one fighter, again, whose name escapes me, the last one to hold the title, comes out of retirement and says, okay, I'll fight him, I'm going to lick him. Well, Johnson beat the crap out of him, and everybody else for about the next 5 or 6 years. Unfortunately for Johnson, he also happened to like women quite a bit, quite a number of women. And he married some of them. He generally did not marry them. And at one point, one of the women who had been his partner was working as a prostitute in New York City. He was in Chicago. And she wrote him and said, listen, I don't have any money. I really want to come to Chicago. Please send me some money so I can take a train to Chicago. He sends her the money. Aha! Violation of the Mann Act. Prostitute crossing state lines. And so Johnson was the first, and for many decades, the only person ever prosecuted under the Mann Act in the United States. He fled to Europe, but unfortunately for him started World War I. His career declined and so on. But he's got an autobiography. You should read that too. It's very, very interesting. In any case, this gets us down to the point where I'm going to get off of the historical kind of thing. But basically, since the British opposition had started it, the British also, as I'm sure you know, had quite an influence internationally. They had people all over China. They had people eventually in Thailand, in various places. The French usually were considered people who had been in the area that we now call, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, that area. But the British had influence other places. Wherever the British had influence, it was the upper class British who influenced. It was not the lower classes. And the upper class British gave that kind of thing, oh, prostitution, the lowest of the low, how can you do this, or whatever, and spread many of these ideals among the upper classes in most countries. If you go to Thailand, if you talk to anybody in the upper classes, you will find they're very anti-prostitution. Oh, those girls, those women. But if you talk to anybody who is in the common class of people, they don't look at it that way. It's like it's Buddhist. It's you do what you have to do. If you can support your parents this way, you do it. So you get very different results depending on which class of person you happen to interview about that kind of thing. Vietnam War does some interesting things. I'm not going to talk about that a lot. U.S. is blamed very often for starting prostitution in Thailand. People who say that really don't have any sense of the history of that. I can talk about that if you want in a question later. I'm just going to jump over and jump a whole lot of history, jump up to about 2005, and just give you a couple of real quick, interesting things. In 2005, I don't have the name, I can find the person. Anyway, someone comes up and says, there's going to be a Super Bowl in Dallas, and please, it may have been 2006, 2004, I think it's 2005. Going to be a Super Bowl, and did you know there are going to be 25,000 trafficked women who appear at the Super Bowl, and they're all going to be forced into sex work? Well, Dallas police immediately jump into action, and the Dallas police, get all these squads out, and nothing happens. They have 13 arrests, as I recall, during the week prior to the Super Bowl. Normally the range is between 13 and 50. So, nothing. Nobody shows up. You can argue, well, they were all there and they can't find them. Trafficking is always hidden. No, it's not. If it's there, you can find it. You have to look. The entire police force of Dallas was looking. They didn't find it. Next year, Tampa, again, I may be a year off, same thing, except this time 50,000 women are going to show up who are trafficked. Didn't show up, same thing, no difference. In fact, I think trafficking arrests went down that week from a normal of about 12 to I think only a single trafficking arrest. And the woman who advertised herself as the head of the local prostitutes union came out and said, what's wrong with all these men? All they want to do is watch football. So even the local people couldn't get work, let alone any other people who might have brought in. When you start thinking about what's the motivation for trafficking, it's not to enslave people, it's to make money. The whole motivation is profit. And if you can't make a profit, why are you going to bring in one, let alone 25,000 or 50,000 people? You get the same thing that happened at the Miami Super Bowl. You get the same thing that happens at a World Cup. Kevin and I were together a number of years ago at a conference in Boston, and I don't recall who, but it was a very young man, I think a college student, who was there advertising that there were going to be 100,000 hookers who showed up, most of whom were trafficked at the World Cup. Nobody shows up at the World Cup. These are invented stories. They are people's imagination run wild. I don't know why people do that, but people do. I could give you a lot of examples in other situations where people make up things like that. We see maybe bad sexual dreams behind ourselves. Maybe we project that to others. I don't know. But in any case, let me move on to the kind of thing that Ron's been talking about now. I'm not doing too bad on time. That's good. I didn't know how long it would take me to get through that. And I'll just say that a lot of this is going to have to do ultimately with the issue of macro data versus micro data. The macro data, you can't get it without micro data. If you get it, 20,000 women showing up for this, 500,000 or whatever for that. No, there aren't any micro numbers. Somebody just made up the figure. So let's look a little bit here at made up figures. If I can find my next page of notes. We did that? All right. Done with that. Let's try something similar but a little closer to home, and that is Bangkok. In 1988, the Bangkok Post printed an editorial. And the editorial trumpeted a particular claim that there were 800,000 prostitutes in Bangkok, and 2 million prostitutes, I said Bangkok, sorry, 2 million prostitutes in Thailand, 800,000 of whom are children. Well, you want to make headlines. Hey, how's this? This story, although the Bangkok Post said, we don't know, in an editorial, we're not sure, this claim has been made, we're not sure. CNN, everybody picks it up. You can still see things on CNN and History Channel and other things about all these prostitutes in Thailand, most of whom are children. Well, the Thai government does not take kindly to these kinds of things, especially if it's a tax on the king. The king is a very, very, very sacred person, and it's a very sacred kind of thing. You don't attack the king in Thailand, but this was an attack on the royal family in some ways, and it was seen that way. And so the royal government put together a panel, and the panel investigated this claim. Finally, they brought forth the one person who was an NGO employee who had made this particular claim. And they said, okay, tell us how it is that you know this to be true. One of my friends was on the panel, a guy who initially got me into this, as a matter of fact. I got in by studying AIDS back in 1988. And Wiris Siddhatrai, who's, I think, associate head of AIDS for the World Health Organization. Anyway, he's the one who was on the panel and kind of got me into doing this kind of research. Well, he was on it, a number of people were on it, and they said, how did you get this number? Well, the answer was very simple. It said, well, I simply multiplied 2 million times, what was it, I guess 40%. 2 million, where'd you get these numbers? Well, I went into 2 brothels, and in each of those brothels, I determined that there were about 40% of the girls who looked to me as though they were underage. Well, what kind of I didn't do a test. I can tell a girl she was underage. They were underage. Well, this was a Western person, and if you look at Thai people, I have done the experiment. I've taken people at a conference on AIDS back about 15 years ago down through Pat Pong, and I said, okay, here's this lady who's selling scarves over on the side. About how old is she? And they looked at her and I said, my God, she's 12, 13. I said, she's 37. She's been doing that for many, many years. It's very difficult for Westerners, unless you're familiar with Asian faces, to make accurate judgments of that. But nonetheless, he said these 2 things. Well, where did you get the 2 million? They asked him. Well, everyone knows there are 2 million sex workers in Thailand. Therefore, 40% of 2 million is 800,000. Okay, that's the evidence. That's the evidence. A rumor, not even a rumor, just a general belief, sort of like the Earth rotates around the Earth rotates around the sun rather than vice versa. 2 million seconds. Where'd you get this? No evidence at all. And so the Thai government has been very, very strong on this kind of thing. They will fight anybody. Dictionary, American Heritage Dictionary, I think, came out. The Thai government sued them for referring to Bangkok as a place with a lot of prostitutes in the dictionary. They don't particularly like that. Anyway, so we get that. A couple of other quick ones here that are similar along the line, then I'll get to my methods here too. A similar one hit me somewhere around 10 years ago. There's a gentleman whose family name is Perrin, P-E-R-I-N, who's a Canadian, operates somewhere out of British Columbia. And there was an article in I think it was, I don't know, could have been Saskatchewan. I'm quite sure it's British Columbia. Anyway, article in there. And in this article, news article, cited his study, in quotes, that said that there were 80,000 to 100,000 trafficked women in Cambodia, many of whom were children. Well, it's funny, 800,000 down to 80,000 in Cambodia. Well, smaller population, smaller country or whatever. So I looked into that one, and I contacted him, and his representatives were quite happy to talk to me up until I said, look, I'm really questioning your numbers. Where did you get all this? And then they did not want to respond very much after that. But in any case, what he did is he said, well, we went out and we tried to find the numbers, but we couldn't, and so we talked to experts. That's always good. You don't know, let's talk to experts. Well, what were the experts you talked to? Well, one of them was a guy that I talked to, as a matter of fact, the head of AFASIP at the time, and he did know quite a bit about that kind of thing, but he was never the kind of person who was going to give out a number because he knew that he did not really know. And but no, I'll talk to all these people. How does somebody know if they didn't do a study? Well, they're experts. Why are they experts? Well, they take in these women. Okay, so they learn from the trafficked women how many trafficked women there are. Yes. Well, how do you do that? How does a trafficked woman know how many trafficked women there are? What's the experience of a trafficked woman? She's in a room, especially if she's in really a bad shape trafficking situation. She sees the people around her. She has no idea of the others unless there are constantly others running through there. And usually if you're in a brothel for quite some time, anywhere from 6 weeks to 6 months, you're in the same place, you may get moved then. How does a trafficked woman know how many trafficked people there are? Suppose you were to take Yogi Berra and ask Yogi Berra, I pick him because Yogi was not, let's say, the brightest light on the street, and ask him, hey Yogi, how many people play baseball in the United States? What would he say? He wouldn't know. Why would any baseball player know how many baseball players there are? Why would any prostitute know how many prostitutes there are? That's not the kind of experience that they have. They don't know that. That is not within their measure of experience. So experts who only learn from other people who also don't know are not expert at all. You can't learn from talking to experts unless they have some very good study or some very good way of actually knowing. You've got to get down to people who have actually studied it. So a common kind of thing with this 80 to 100,000, and if you want, you can look at some of my articles that are published and whatever. I'll give you URLs and whatever for these. You can find them. I go through them. Basically, what they do is they say, well, we followed this one, the Cambodian Human Development Report. That's a government report. I went and talked to the planning division in Cambodia and said, how the heck did you guys get these numbers? Somebody apparently forced one of those numbers in. Apparently, a female who was the wife of somebody says, you're going to put those numbers in. Usually, that's a pretty good report. But that's what started it. In any case, the numbers never came near anywhere 80 to 100,000. Finally, what they were is somebody went to a lecture in Bangkok and talked to a guy who was the head of a local office of IOM, not ILO, but IOM. And he, in a thing, said, we think there are, and threw out this number, as many as 100,000 or 80,000 with this smaller number of children and whatever else. But you get all of these studies. UNICEF cites it, the Human Development Report cites it, but they all come back down to this one thing. Marsapia, this little officer in this one particular office, I interviewed him, and I said, hey, I just happened to notice that in your file that your secretary let me look at, they were all very nice, and said, hey, look through our stuff. Here I find finally an actual printout of this number. Do you know where this came from? He says, I don't recall saying that, but my secretary was there. I must have said it. Okay, that's the quality. He doesn't know anything. He just says the number, and suddenly the number becomes, common knowledge that everybody knows this is the truth. It's not the truth. It's just junk. Okay, so another one. Let's just. Here's a typical thing, and I guess I got time to do this last one too. This one just really burns me, as many of these do, I guess. It's what I call the impossible-estimated-published cycle. Okay. First statement will be, it is impossible to estimate the number of trafficked women there are. Part two, we estimate that there are a certain number of trafficked women. Someone then picks this up and says, aha, here is the estimate of trafficked women, and it's published. Okay? And then somebody goes back and says, well, we don't know how to estimate the number of trafficked women. We estimate that there are. What? What kind of logic is that? I don't know. Hopefully that would not pass in an undergraduate or even a high school classroom, but people get away with that. So I just have to mention that one too. And now, okay, we estimated that, we did that, we did all this, okay. I could go through some, just a couple of other things that I'll mention in a moment. Basically, I've said what we don't need is a lot of that kind of thing, and much of it is a failure to go to the actual site and gather data, as Ron has mentioned. What we need are first, not just anybody to go to that site, but observers who are at least somewhat familiar with sex work or with whatever they're observing. It may not be sex work. Much larger is the number of men taken for seafaring labor. They go out on a ship. What are you going to do? You're out on a ship. You're not in sight of land. Hey, no, you don't have to work for us. That's fine. You're not going to eat. And, so 18 months later, the guy comes back. They let him off somewhere. Don't pay him, and that's it. That's one of the worst forms of trafficking. Can't get rid of that. But nobody seems to be excited about those people. They're excited about women who are forced into sex work generally, not the larger numbers. You need, in addition to observers who are familiar with sex work, if you're going to study sex work, or observers who are familiar with that male form of trafficking, or children for begging, or something like that, be familiar with that first. Second, you got to have direct, personal, in-country experience. It's not enough just to know. You need to know in that country, because you got to speak at least a little of the language, or know somebody really well who speaks it really well, and you can trust. And then there's stuff about the multi-trait, multi-matrix approach to measurement, but I'm going to skip that at the moment and get on with some of the other kinds of recent measurements, and then my measurement here. So if I'm lucky, I'm putting the right one over there and picking up the correct one over here. Okay. We start to get to U.S. government kinds of estimates. And when we get to U.S. government estimates, one of the first ones of those that came out was, if I can find, where's my chart? Here's my chart, good. One of the first ones of those that came out was in 2001. I couldn't remember if it was 2000 or 2001. And as several people have mentioned, the Bush administration was responsible for a lot of this. And so the Bush administration establishes the Office of Human Trafficking under the State Department. One of the people working in that office is a woman by the name of Amy O'Neill Richard. Amy and I had a number of conversations on the telephone, and I asked her, Amy, you were the person who kind of came up with these numbers for this report? Yeah. And if you look at the report, I just had it here, and if I can find it, well, I guess I can't even find that report here, okay? But anyway, she's the one who came up with the numbers in that initial report, the initial tip report. And the initial numbers were, at least 700,000 in that report. And then the numbers started to change. Well, I wanted to know where that initial number came from. In the report, it's very vague, as several people, Ron and others have mentioned. Where did this 700,000 come to? So I asked her, and she said, well, I went to, actually, it's not my number. She said, I went to a briefing over at the CIA, and the CIA was talking about this, and it's the CIA's number. We'll try to get information out of the CIA. Hi, is this the CIA? Where'd you get those? You're right. You're not going to get very far on that. I sent grad students and various people with wonderful sounding voices. Nobody gets through to the CIA that way. That just does not work. But as luck would have it, University of Miami has a resident CIA agent. Not a hidden agent, not a secret. Everyone knows he's there. He's one of these people who reads books and then talks about the CIA, attempts to recruit, that kind of thing. Very nice guy, as a matter of fact. This was 7-8 years ago now. And so I invited him many times to come to my classes. And then I thought, Amy, CIA, this guy, I said, listen, I got this question here. Amy Richard says that the CIA gave this number. Know anything about it? Of course, he didn't know anything about it. Could you check? Is there any? Well, 2 months later, he's got a number of his friends in who happen to be in Miami, and we all sit down and we have a drink. And I kind of look at him like, can I ask? And go ahead, ask. I said, listen, I got this problem here. Can anybody help me with this? This number was apparently given in this seminar, and here's the thing that says that, Amy Richard. Can anybody find out how this number was obtained, whatever? I said, not going to promise you, but maybe. And if you know, you will be told only once, and it will be really rapid, and you will not record, and you will not, all these kind of, no, sounds like I might get it, great. A couple months later, I got a phone call. I'm in my office, and it says, hello, who's this? It's Tom Steinfatt, who's this? I'm going to tell you one thing. I'm going to tell you only once, and this is it, okay? The persons who made up the numbers, the words made up were used, and not whatever, I created, one of the two. The person who created the number were asked how they created the number. The answer was, had a lot of pressure from the State Department, and we pulled it out of our ear. Click, that's it. Now, it could have been a crank phone call. It didn't sound like it. I fully believe that the CIA, under pressure from the State Department, pulled it out of their ear. That's where the number came from initially. So that number stood, and you can see about how good that number is compared to some of the other numbers here, not much better, but that seemed reasonable, whatever. So the State Department goes through. I have a chart that I prepared of all the State Department reports. These are all the tip reports and what their numbers were. Let me just read you quickly, because I don't want to bore you too much with numbers, but 2001, at least 700,000, especially women and children across international borders. 2002, at least 700,000. They stayed consistent, but they put an upper limit on it, but no more than 4 million. That wasn't in the first report. Who's trafficked? Well, men, women, and children, and that's a worldwide number. 2003, they start giving two different numbers, but with two different reference, and the lower limit, best estimate, 800,000. Don't say how they got up 100,000. Upper limit, 900,000, so way down from the 4 million, and it's just listed as people, but also at one point specified men, women, and children across international borders and so on. They stay with that only for the 1 year, because in 2004 they dropped to 600,000 with a maximum of 800,000, again with the reference changing slightly. One point it's women only. The numbers are about the same, but at one point men, women, and children, then men. So we're jumping all over in what this refers to. Does this sound like a figure that is carefully gathered together from numbers that have been studied somewhere? It's starting to sound very suspicious. So 2006 we get that, but it mentions it, or 2005 mentions it a second time, says millions of victims somewhere else. I think the millions of victims, in fairness, refers to people within national borders, because they start saying, well, the 600 to 800,000 is across international borders, but they don't make it clear that that's what they're saying. Similar thing in 2006 from 2005. 2007 changes radically. 2007, the number is suddenly up to 12.3 million. And the 12.3 million is kind of interesting for a number of reasons, but that 2007 report also lists in different places 4 million worldwide at another point, 600,000 millions. It's all over the place in 2007. But I'm going to stop there for one reason, because in 2007, they stopped depending on the original Richards number, which came from the CIA, which came from here. Okay, and in 2007, they had gotten enough flack. I'm sure people other than me were calling them and asking them, what's going on here? Where are these numbers? And so what they did is they went to not the IOM, but the ILO. And the ILO had done a study using what's called a capture-recapture method. Capture-recapture was done first in 1896 by a biologist from Purdue, I believe, who wanted to know how many minnows there were in a small pool. Well, try to figure out, you got this thing here, here's this pond, how many minnows are there? What, you count them, what are you going to do? You can kill them, I guess, and count them, but even then you're not sure. And so what he did is he developed a capture-recapture method that was published in 1896. And he counted the minnows that he could count on a day, spent all day counting minnows. He marked them, he doesn't say how, in a way that he could tell which ones were marked the next day, but which were not harmful to them in any way. I don't know if we believe him or not, but he says that's what he did. So then on the next day he came back and he again counted minnows, but this time he had two counts, marked and unmarked. Now, if you've got the number, I'm not going to go through all the math, but it's not too hard, it's just basic algebra. If you just go through and figure, okay, I got the number that I counted on the first day. Now that I've got the number of those on the second day that were marked, and the number, I can find a proportion of marked versus unmarked, go back and put that on the first proportion, voila, get a pretty decent estimate of the second. Well, that's a capture-recapture method. That's the principal method that ILO was using, and that's the method that the State Department began to use. IOM has pretty much stayed out of it, except I just found this recently. Here's an IOM 2011 kind of thing where the IOM is now estimating numbers also. They, however, are estimating only, and not really estimating, they're giving actual numbers. How many trafficking cases did they actually encounter in 2011? And across all the nations that they worked in, they encountered 5,498 cases. They don't claim that that's the upper number, of course it's not, but that's the number of ones that they encountered. We would assume that that must be a very minimum kind of figure, so there clearly are people there. How are we doing? I still got about 10 minutes, or how much have I got here? Something like that? You're going to give me 10. Thank you. Okay. Well, then let me tell you the way that I do it. Okay, after all of this kind of stuff here. Basically, what I do and what I did is back in 2001, I went to Phnom Penh, Cambodia. I'd been there a few times before, but I'd never attempted data collection before. And I just looked at all the way people were doing it, and I thought, wait a minute, I'm in communication. These people are in business, that is, people who are traffickers, that's what they're out for. They want to earn money. If you don't believe that, I have a 31-part theory that leads you to that conclusion, I hope. Be glad to share it with you, but not orally right now. But they're in business for money. That's the whole thing. It's a profit motive. Well, if you're going to make a profit, what are you going to do? You run a mom-and-pop store over here, sell beer and potato chips. How are you going to make money? Repeat customers? No way. Repeat customers may keep you in business, but repeat customers are never, ever going to make a lot of money for you. You must engage new customers all the time and hope those new customers will bring in other customers, not just repeat customers bringing in people. How are you going to get new customers? Well, only one way. You got to advertise. Fine. So you take a TV ad, hi, come to Mark's Bravo or something. Well, can't do that. So what do? You hire the bus driver who brings people in from the airport. No, there are too many people on the bus. Somebody is going to get the idea that maybe they want to investigate that rather than anything else. But when you look around, who is it who is offering you sex? Well, it's really obvious who it is. In Phnom Penh, it's moto drivers and occasionally cab drivers. Moto drivers are just motorcycle drivers who take you around on the back of a motorcycle, a little Honda 50 or maybe a 90 or something like that. And, they take you to these places. So the method we developed, it took a lot longer than this to do, and we used basically 5 people to do it with. And when we got started with the studies, I did one myself in 2001, then we got funded by USAID and then later by UNIAP to do these. And And essentially the method is this. You take 5 people. I take 5 people I can trust very well. I'm one of those 5 people. And we start out on a given morning from a hotel. Walk at least 1 block, maybe 2 blocks from the hotel. When you walk that far, look around and hail any moto driver that you see among the first 5 who is actually traveling along the street. Do not select anybody who is here. There are reasons for that. They're of non-randomness. So select somebody out there, hop the thing, and when he asks you where do you want to go, probably in Khmer, you can just tell him in English, they'll understand that. Take me somewhere where I can buy sex, okay? Not an unusual request at all. Quite usual. So, fine, no problem. So he'll take you to the first place. Have a little GPS unit with a little antenna on it, and when you get to that point, click, okay? And you've got that one located. You say, well, thank you, but I don't want to go inside. Moto driver is initially surprised. No, you go inside, because he's going to get a rate off and a kickback if you spend any money in there. No, thank you. I'm just looking. I just want to see. If you don't want to take me any farther, that's fine. Oh, fine. Okay, I'll take you farther. Show me another one. Now, as soon as he's either tired or wants to quit or whatever else, that's fine. Pay him off, let him go. Most people, most of the drivers will go all day because they're getting paid off not too handsomely. That's going to be too suspicious, but they're going to get paid 20, 30, 40% more than they would probably expect to make. When all 5 observers go a full 3 days each without being able to add any new venues, we consider that we're about 90 to 95% accurate at that point. We know there are others that we've missed, but we know that we've got a whole lot of them. And we've got them every night. They're put into a laptop map program, so we've got little points, and we sometimes see, oh, wait a minute, this one is only 20 feet from that one. You must have approached from another side. So sometimes we've got duplicates. At the same time, we're going to the police, and the police keep reports on entertainment places. As you've heard, that's what they're usually called. And so we go through the entertainment place reports, and we look at the addresses. Any of these that somehow we've missed, every once in a while we'll get one. Usually we find that the police reports overestimate simply because the police never take one off even when it closes. They just add new places when they're on. So we find a lot of closed places. But we also found, I think, almost all, maybe 1 or 2 extra we got from there. We also did what we call the city block sampling method, in which we randomly selected 4 different city blocks and observed those constantly for about a 4 to 5 day period. Just had observers stationed there, local people, not somebody here sitting with binoculars or whatever, just local people who sit in a noodle shop or have a beer or do whatever people did on the street at that point, and just look for activity that looked like it might be number of men that you wouldn't expect going into a particular place or whatever else. And in that way, we did discover a very, very, very few extra, and we figured, okay, there's a small percentage that we're finding here over what we found by the other method, so we multiplied our initial figure by that particular proportion. There are a couple of little corrections in there that we did. Basically, the way that we gathered the data, however, is once we've got the places, the first part of it is location, and I've explained the location thing. Location doesn't tell you a whole lot unless you go in. So the next thing that we do is we use what's called a demographic similarity method. At least that's what I call it, is demographic similarity. If this is a place where there are going to be people who look like me who are going in and out of there, we just observe the customer base going in and out of the front door or back or side doors or whatever there are. And we look, who are these people? Well, these look like Western Europeans, or they look like Americans. No, these guys are Singaporean, those are Chinese, this one's Australian, whatever else. We pick somebody of the same demographics as is the majority demographics of the people who are going in and out. And that person just goes in, just looks around. If the person can, they ask questions of not the workers who are there, because generally you don't do that. You don't normally walk into one of these places and start talking to a worker. The women are usually sitting around in some kind of a circle. Depending on how long they've been there and how old they are, most of them are involved in chatting. Many of them these days are on cell phones. I wonder about women being on cell phones who can't talk to anybody, who constantly have cell phones. I've never seen a worker in a brothel in Cambodia over the last 5 years, anyway, who didn't have a cell phone. And if somebody doesn't, they borrow the one next door. They're constantly in contact outside. I don't know what that says about trafficking or not. We're trying to figure that out. But in any case, we go in, you talk to the management workers, how much for anyone, how long. Here, can this lady go back to my hotel with me? You've got to have somebody come with her, or can she go alone? Also, we have some methods that ask about debt contracts, and I don't want to go into the explanation of that, but there are a couple of ways. It's a little complicated as to how we get into that. But if we can find either the person has a debt contract or that they simply can't leave without escort, that person is definitely counted is trafficked. If, on the other hand, the person, we usually have somebody else going in, not at exactly the same time, because we don't want too many of our people in, on another day, on a different day, somebody who can sit down and talk to the girls, and that's usually moto drivers. Moto drivers come in and spend a lot of their time sitting with the girls until a customer comes in, that girl leaves, but he's still talking and everybody's joking and having beers or whatever else. And so those people just talk, and we find out from that moto driver the questions that we've asked him. We are very careful not to train observers. You'll find that some people in social sciences go into, you must have trained observers. They got it. We don't train people. We ask people, find this information for us. If they want to know why we want to know the information, we say something along the line of, oh, well, we're planning to have a big party. Some of my friends are coming in from out country. We're wondering about these things, whatever. Anything that, okay, they don't want much of an explanation. And usually they don't ask at all. And so they just go in, they find the information, they give it. I got a picture here. A guy, see the writing there in Khmer on his hand. Those are the notes he's taken. He's not allowed to take notes inside. He cannot write anything down. That's the deal. We kind of have somebody watching to make sure that he comes out, writes them down, and then gives them to us or whatever. But from those notes or from his memory, we want to know things like how many appear to be, quote, small ladies. That's usually the euphemism for women who are underage. How many small ladies, how many Khmer, how many Vietnamese. There's a strong prejudice in Cambodia. If somebody has Vietnamese workers, not going to find any Khmer workers. The Khmer workers, no Vietnamese workers. Anybody's allowed in as customers, thank you. Anybody's allowed in as customers, but very, very segregated in terms of ethnicity. Khmer people, I don't know why, have a real distaste for Vietnamese, and Vietnamese don't want, even though they're heavily involved in Cambodia, don't want anything to do otherwise. Very, very little mixing of the groups there. There's probably a whole lot more that I could tell you and should tell you about this, but I'm running out of time, and I should probably stop and just ask for some kinds of questions here about all the things that I haven't told you. So that'll give you. Yes, Sharon?
Tell just one thing.
Oh, sure.
The servitude when they arrest go in, just tell them briefly, because some people may not know that.
Oh,
when they
all
go
right.
in, they
Okay.
arrest them.
Oh,
You
yeah.
should know
Okay.
that.
Sure. Yeah. This is my wife here, and she gets in by asking me
I'm a
anything.
nurse, and so
Anything I want.
I
Yeah.
feel so strong.
Yeah. When we're there observing things like this, every once in a while there'll be a crackdown. And back about 3-4 years ago, the police, probably because of the UN and the United States more than anything, started this crackdown on sex work to make it look good. And so the police will go into a brothel. And you'll see it. It's a really awful thing to watch. It's the same thing you see traditionally in Vietnam, with the cops coming in with clubs and just starting to beat people. Suddenly this whole thing will come in, guys in the typical city of Miami Ninja Turtle outfits. Whenever they've got a demonstration in Miami and they want to suppress it, we bring those guys out there with their gas masks and their guns and everything. So these guys look just like that. They hop out of these big trucks you wouldn't think even existed in Phnom Penh. They rush into a particular brothel. You hear a lot of screaming as they start to go in. You hear a lot of whacking. And then there's a period of silence where we're pretty sure that the guys are having sex, which they're obviously not going to pay for. And then the guys leave, and people start streaming out with wounds of various kinds. And then that place closes, and it just closes relatively permanently. But the women show up somewhere else not too long after that. Is that the kind of thing you were?
But they've already been paid. The families have been paid for that person.
Oh, okay. Oh, you want that? Okay.
Important.
Let me give you that one too.
Because
Okay.
it's causing younger and younger people to prostitute.
Okay. I have not studied Saigon, but I have been in Saigon a lot of times. And one time I just happened to be at a place at the right time. It was an apartment in Saigon, and we were just sitting talking to a family. I've got a friend who drives a motorcycle there who worked with the Americans during the Vietnam War. His son and grandson now do that. But he was kind of taking me around. I said, can I see a place? Well, Americans aren't allowed to go to a place, but I'll take you in. So he gets into this one very, very poor apartment building. So I'm sitting and I'm talking, having tea with this family that's very impressed to have an American in there. And there's a knock on the door. And a woman comes down, and I understand from the guy that they're referring to her as Auntie. So Auntie, whoever that is, comes in. And she says essentially, oh, I understand. She kind of talks to me for a moment, but she wants to talk to the family. I understand you're having financial difficulties. Well, I have some little money I can help out. Oh, we couldn't pay you back. Not no way we can pay you back. Well, please, here, take this money, it's okay, you've got these debts, how much do you need? Oh, not much, US 50 or what, well, here's US $200. Oh, we can't possibly pay, no, US $200, it's okay. No, well, the family accepts maybe $100, okay? And then they can pay off their debts, they've got a couple of other kinds of things. Well, then, what happens is you get the story from other things because you don't see it happen immediately, but when you're back there, the woman then takes the older daughter to work it off, as you've probably heard here, someplace, very often in Phnom Penh, maybe in a place called Steinfatt, also known as K11, which was put out of business by IJM a while back. Some interesting stories about that. But anyway, she gets taken in there. Eventually there is a raid. IJM or somebody else comes in, International Justice Mission, comes in, and there's a raid. And all the women are taken out, whether these women are trafficked, whether they are working there voluntarily, whatever else. Everybody loses their ancestor pictures. Everybody loses their money. Everybody loses their place of work. They're taken to some place like AFACEP, which is that's a French acronym for a fairly large NGO that takes care of a lot of these people and advertises that they have gone out to find these people. They have not. The police take them to the State Department takes them to the NGO. And then the NGO puts them in a pen with a lot of barbed wire and broken glass on the top to protect them from the pimps trying to get in. Normally, the people are trying to get out. There was a big scandal about that called Che Or 2. That's the name of a bar where a lot of women escaped the minute the doors were open. They all ran out, whereas it was supposed to be the pimps running in. They ran out, got into trucks, and drove away. But in any case, when that woman is there, there's going to be another phone call back to that apartment. Hi, you've paid back 25 of the $100. That's really nice, but we don't see any money coming in. Isn't your daughter still working in Phnom Penh? Something along that line. And when you get that phone call, it's like, well, sorry, we don't know why. Nobody's, well, you have this other daughter. The first one was 17. Say, no, this one's 14 or 50. Maybe she could go to work. And so unless that girl gets out of the pen and she knows that not only can she not support her family, but her younger sister is going to get hauled into it too. So the effects of raids are not necessarily positive in all cases. That doesn't always happen, but there are a number of cases that are definitely citable where women who are pulled into those, we're going to rescue you, don't necessarily want to be rescued. Maybe they want to be rescued for themselves, but not for what's going to happen to the rest of their family, because there is a debt contract. When you've got a debt contract, you can take, I hope, the rest of that, or if you can't, I'll stop. You can ask questions.
Thank you very much, Tom.
Sure,
we have maybe time for one or two questions before we wrap up.
I'm wondering if you went so fast there at the end that you might have left out some of the most important findings. First of all, you counted the number of people working in the sex industry in Phnom Penh, and it was much lower than these other astronomical figures.
Yes, sure.
Okay, so that I think
I'm
needs to
sure
be
we should
said.
have done that. We also did the count for the number around Cambodia. There were a number of figures. One was a 1997 National Assembly study. National Assembly, like the Congress of Cambodia did it. Their studies were not that far off from ours. But all of the others, these huge estimates of 800,000 or whatever they were, we weren't anywhere near that.
And the second
those
part,
figures are available.
Right. The second part is that did you not estimate the percent who were trafficked?
Oh, yes.
Based upon your observations in.
Sure.
And so could you tell us a bit more about how you did that?
Okay.
I think you said that any woman who couldn't leave the brothel unescorted was categorized as trafficked?
Yes, even though that may not be traffic. It's as close as we could come.
I mean, if they're just working within the brothel and
If
they're
they're
not allowed
working
to
within
do
the brothel,
alcohol.
they can't go anywhere else. Obviously, they're not trusted for some reason. Why are they not trusted?
Well,
normally, you can take a woman, you can go back to a hotel with her, you can do anything. But why can't you do that with this woman?
so in most brothels, you can do alcohols.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Sure. Normally, you can do that. Yeah, it's going to cost you more.
So
They're
roughly,
going to figure you're a rube if you want to do that, and they're going to, what would normally be $20 is likely to be $200.
so roughly what percent of the sex workers that you estimated work in Phnom Penh?
It's in there, and I can look, but it's small. It's somewhere in the area between, depending on where you look, 5 to 12%, something like that.
Okay.
5 to 12. Some places much smaller and some places much larger. But some there definitely is trafficking. And people who don't want to be trafficked, that is a terrible situation for them. It's just equally terrible if you take people who don't want to be pulled out of there and pull them out of
Monty, a quick question.
So what was the number for Cambodia that?
Oh gosh, I try not to do it without, just a second, let me ask another question and let me look up the numbers here, guys.
I'll tell you what we will do is Tom, we'll go for a break, and then when we
I'll look it up and
start,
I'll just stand out here and I'll give them to you. I've got them right here on the things. I'll find them. I'm sorry, I should have done that.
would you join me in thanking Tom for that?